Good afternoon, everyone. Peter here, and today I would like to show you a victory I had against a 2000 rated chess.com AI. And without further ado, let's get into it. So, started off with the Caro-Kann opening. I prefer moving my knight back here just because, I think that's the best place to put the knight. And I noticed that the bishop went back, and so one of the benefits of putting this knight here is actually to cover the h5 square. So now the bishop cannot come here and create this pin. And so that's why I also place my knight here, and this knight defends the d4 pawn, which could potentially be attacked. Obviously, this queen is putting pressure on it, but, in the future, as more pieces are brought out, we could see more pieces building up an attack on this central square. And as you can see already, the center is generally open. My opponent has control over, several of these squares here, and I'm potentially going to open up the bishop, and these knights have a lot of control over central squares. So next we see knight d7, bishop d3. I'm looking to trade off the bishops here and bring the queen up into a more centralized square, and then this queen will basically dominate the light squares. Instead, we see e5 from my opponent, and this is already clearly a mistake, I noticed, and the reason being is because, the square is already fairly weak. I already have two pieces attacking it. He only has one, this knight here. And, it could get tricky, if I were to take this pawn, for example, if he took back. The danger is whenever this knight basically comes to c5, because then you're putting pressure on this bishop 3 times. With this bishop, the queen would then be opened, and the knight would also have an attack. So if you can picture that, three against 1 is not good. All I would have defending it would be the c-pawn and my queen, and so chances are I would be losing material, or at least I would be in a worse position. So noticing this, I basically knew I was forced to take the bishop here. That's why it's a great move. It's the only winning move here. And this is also a good move by my opponent, given the circumstances, because when you have a situation like this, you want to take the pawn that, brings the most activity to your position. Sometimes it's not good to take one way or another. It depends on the position. So there's no real general rule except maybe, supporting the center, trying to avoid pawn island. And, in this case, it opens up the rook for this file. And, if I were to castle, for example, that could create some pressure along here, if my knight, my f3 knight were to go. So I do castle, which is a mistake. Frankly, I wasn't worried about this because I had my knight here, and I figured if he pushes this pawn, I can take back with my knight on e4. So I wasn't too concerned. Mainly I castled because I wanted to get the rook centralized, because, that prevents this pawn actually from taking this one because of the pin created. So instead we see queen to e7, and my opponent's intentions clearly are to castle long, but this is bad because it's placing this queen on a pretty vulnerable diagonal that is very quickly going to be opened up. I probably could have taken here, if I were to, for example, take this pawn, and he cannot take with the queen, of course, so he might take with the knight. And if I were to take with this knight, it's free. It's a free knight, actually, because, he cannot take back with the queen because you'll run into this rook to e1 move. And that pins the queen to the king, and then he would lose the queen. So instead, he defends by playing f6, just to defend that pawn. I take, just to try to open up the position, and he takes back with the knight. And this is bad because now this knight is on a very, very bad square. It's being pinned by my rook, and if you were to move the knight at any moment, I would take the queen with check. And so basically, I figure I'll put pressure on this knight, and, to do so, I just put my bishop on f4. Then he brings his rook to d8. I hadn't really thought about this. I just figured he would be wanting to castle, and, I guess clearly at this point, castling might not be an option for him, just because how open his king is already. You don't really like to see diagonals like this weak when you're trying to castle. And of course, this attacks my queen. So I wanted to move it out the way. I was thinking about this idea of moving the king to e2 because of this battery potentially set up, but I was just a little bit concerned about, trading off the queen, he takes back with the bishop, and then I lose some momentum here. And I was looking for more activity rather than just trades. So instead I move my queen to c1, which is not the best move, but not a bad move either. And he's moving his rook now to d5, and that's to defend this knight, of course. And, I just decided to attack it, basically. And, some of you may want to move your pawn to b4. Of course, this just loses the pawn, so that would be a bad move. But you can continue to attack the rook by playing queen to c3, which is what I did here. It's the best move. And you're also putting more pressure on this knight, basically, which is now being attacked 4 times by my queen, bishop, knight, and rook. So instead he moves his queen here, looking to probably trade. If I were to allow him to take my queen from here, I would lead to doubled pawns. And then potentially if he gets his queen out the way, this knight would be able to take the c4 pawn. And so that would lead to basically my queen side becoming very vulnerable in the endgame, because then it'd be a 3-on-2, but then it's like kind of a pawn island anyways. So yeah, would not be a good position, which is why I decided to trade with the hopes of, him taking my queen, and I pick up his queen back with the bishop. Instead he takes, and, I just take the queen here. I probably could have found a better move if I spent more time. The reason why the computer is saying that queen to c2 is good is because now you're targeting the g6 square, and, it's not exactly clear what my opponent will do to defend it. I mean, he could play a number of moves, but, when he does that, it's creating more weaknesses, like no longer defending this knight, if he plays rook to h6. So, yeah, every move comes with a consequence, really. So instead I decided to trade off. I'm letting him attack my rook, but I decided to basically pick up the rook on the next move with a trade that brings my knight to a very active e5 square. It's always good to centralize the knight. It also defends this pawn, although that's not really what I wanted to do. Obviously, the pawn's not being attacked, and it's not good to have my knight in such a open position, without any defense to try to just defend a pawn. Eventually I might want to bring my rook here, but of course I need to push the bishop away before then. He attacks this pawn. It's already defended, so no worries there. And instead I kick the bishop away, mainly just to bring my rook to e1. The computer's saying rook to d1 is better, but similar idea, just centralizing the rook. And after he moves his bishop back, of course my plan comes to fruition, and you see that rook to e1 is the best move. I trade off, he moves his king out the way, and then I basically just defend this pawn. It's a mistake, but I figured that, currently it's 3-on-3, and I don't want this to become 3-on-2 in an endgame. So, he moves his knight up, finally developing it. The knight hasn't moved all game. And this pawn to f3 move basically just blocks the e4 and g4 square from the knight. D5 is also covered already, so this knight is pretty much stuck. And also it gives me some room for my king to come into the game later on. He moves his knight back, which is just a mistake because I'm going to move my rook anyways. My rook has plenty of places to move to, so this move does nothing. And instead it allows my rook to get to g5, which is a really good square because now I'm attacking these doubled pawns, and you can only defend one at a time, and eventually my other pieces will get into the game. As you see, he defends, but I just continue to bring my other pieces into the game. My knight is becoming more active now. He moves his king in, trying to potentially push these pawns later on. I'm bringing my knight in, looking to trade off, but if he doesn't trade off, that could be very consequential. For example, if he moves his king here, my knight gets to take the b7 pawn with check, and then if he tries to move it back, I can just escape. If he moves a pawn, for example, then I can move my knight to e6, which is a check, and then I can pick up this pawn on g7. So, this knight it's not the best move, but in my opinion, it's a very good knight, and trading it off, might have been the best idea just because my knight is so much better than his, but it basically just simplifies the position at this point, and there's not much he can do. His king is over here trying to do double duty, defending all these pawns, which I have a rook blocking this whole, 5th rank, so he really can't even move his king past this point, and his pawns are going to have trouble doing so as well. He takes the knight, and now I take back with the rook. He moves his pawn, attacking my rook. I move my rook back. repetitive moves are not always the best, but I mean, in this case, I just thought it was a simple move. He's bringing his king closer to attack my rook eventually, but I have no concerns. The most important thing is making my king active, and the reason why I moved to h3 is basically to move my king into the game, because if I were to move my king before, then the h2 pawn would fall, because the rook could take it. And I mean, you would trade pawns, basically, because then this g6 pawn would fall, but I just didn't really want to deal with any checks along the side. So f4 protects my rook, and now he's looking to basically trade. I could bring my rook to a square like g3, but then of course the king will come in, and I just didn't really want to deal with that. So instead, I just traded off this rook, knowing that this pawn structure is just bad for him in general. And then 3-on-2 with the king over here it has to be bad. So he trades, and I'm just looking to basically trade off the pawns. And now you can see that basically all along the 5th rank, my pawns are doing work, defending all of these squares that you see red here. And so he attempts to push his pawn. And, I knew I basically could trade off this easily too, just because, what else is he going to do? If I take, he tries to push, well, my b pawn is going to protect the c4 square. If his king moves out the way, I'm just going to start bringing my king up, and, it's basically game over. So he has to trade, and I just bring my king into the game. And as you can see, this whole line here is defended, so I have no problem bringing my king in. I'm not worried about his king at all. He tries to push his pawn up to trade. If I were to take, this would be a mistake, of course, because his king could take and take this pawn. But, I mean, either way, I'm going to be able to take these 2 pawns on the queen side. So instead, I basically just block the king from coming up to these squares. In the future, I'd like to push these up to promote. I trade off. I move my king up. And I just continue to bring it up, basically. This was a good move because now his king is essentially forced back to the square, or just going up, which is the best move. But either way, it's going to become troublesome for him because he's going to lose this g5 pawn, which I take. And as I continue to push my pawns, they just control more and more squares, basically forcing the king into this corner. And I think this move I played, d7, was an interesting move too, just because now it blocks off the square as well, and that forces the king back, and I can just bring my king up to e8, where it will allow me to promote. This move was also crucial. I mean, obviously I'm promoting, but now it leaves the square for the king to move to, so there's no stalemates, and I promote. And I wasn't too concerned about this position. I mean, this is mainly just promoting a pawn, not allowing stalemates, basically. And that was it. That was checkmate. And so, this is a 2000 rated computer. It made some mistakes, which is why it's giving it a poor rating of 1950, but my performance gave me a rating of 2400. 100% in the opening, 76.2 in the middle game, and 93.6 in the end game. And, currently I'm only 1334. I think that's my rapid rating. So clearly I'm underrated. Thank you for watching.